I don't believe men were created to be pawns in someone else's game. I believe we were created to be steward kings, men under authority, yes, but entrusted with real responsibility. Not perfect men, but disciplined ones, men who rule themselves, serve God directly, and refuse to live in fear. This is king, not pawn. See, there's this standard in scripture that most men today, honestly, like they wouldn't really pass. And it's not because they lack any sort of talent or lack any sort of opportunity. It's simply just because they lack alignment. See, in the Old Testament, every king was measured the same way. It didn't say, he was successful, he made a lot of money, he was respected. No, it was none of that, okay? What scripture really said the measure of a good king was this. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, or he did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. See, that was the standard, and nothing to this day has changed despite what culture would tell you. See, the first king we're going to go ahead and talk about in this series, The Way of the Lord, is King Josiah. Because by the time that Josiah becomes king, Israel is not just slightly drifting, okay? It is entirely gone. We're talking about generations of just corrupt leadership, idols everywhere, false worship normalized, truth just quite literally buried, okay? And here's what makes it worse. Most people, they didn't even realize it, because when corruption becomes culture, it stops feeling like corruption. It feels normal. So let's just talk about growing up in a broken system for a second, okay? Because Josiah, he didn't grow up in a righteous environment. He wasn't really surrounded by strong examples. In fact, he inherited a system that was already compromised. And to be fair and to just be real, most men in that position, they just do the same thing. They adapt, they go along with it, they maintain what's already there. They don't really question anything too deeply, because questioning something means responsibility, and responsibility is weight. But here's where Josiah was different, okay? Because scripture says something very specific about him. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and he walked in the way of his father David. Not halfway, not occasionally. He simply aligned. And here's what's interesting about that. He started young, which means this wasn't even about experience either, okay? It was about posture. There's a moment when you read his story, there's a moment that Josiah's reign defined him. And this is where they find the book of the law. And this is really important, because that it meant that truth had been lost, not just ignored, but lost entirely, buried just under generations and generations of compromise. And when they read it to him, everything shifts. Okay? So imagine that for a moment, okay? Imagine where you think you're doing fine, you think things are going mostly okay, and then suddenly you see clearly. Not partially, but fully. You realize, wow, okay, this is not aligned. We've been way off. This entire system is wrong. And speaking from firsthand experience, okay, that kind of realization is heavy, because now you are accountable. And this is where most men delay, okay, where most men hesitate. They see the truth, but they wait. They say to themselves, I need more time. I need to think about it. I'll adjust slowly. And that's because, unfortunately, delay is comfortable. And comfort, as we've talked about multiple times already on this channel, is dangerous, okay? Because the longer you delay obedience, the easier it becomes to ignore it. Okay, Josiah, he didn't delay. When Josiah hears the law, he doesn't hesitate. Okay, he doesn't soften it. He doesn't reinterpret it. He doesn't even negotiate with it. He just acts, and he acts immediately. Okay? So what was it that he actually did? This is the part where it starts to get really interesting, because he didn't just make a statement. He didn't just believe differently. He literally restructured the entire nation. Okay? He tore down idols. He destroyed false altars. He removed corrupt leaders. He restored true worship, reestablished the covenant, and not symbolically, okay? Literally, he did all of those things. This was not just passive alignment. This was aggressive reform. So let's go ahead and contrast that to modern men. Okay, men who talk but don't actually move. So, we as men, we hear truth all the time, right? Through sermons, scripture, through own personal convictions that we have. And what do? You know, these men, they agree, they nod along, they say, oh, yeah, that's good. And then they go back to the same old patterns. There's no change, no action, no reform, because ultimately, knowing the truth, that's the easy part. Okay, living it is costly. And Josiah, he understood the cost. Josiah knew something that most men avoid, which is if you align with truth, something will have to be torn down. Habits, environments, relationships, even the very systems themselves. Alignment always costs something. And most men would honestly rather stay comfortable than pay that price. So let's talk about the man who actually knows, okay? Because there's a moment in every man's life where he knows, and I can say that we know, okay? We're not guessing, we're not wondering, we just know. And what is it that we know? That something needs to change, okay? It could be what we're watching, could be how we live, who we surround ourselves with, could even be how they handle personal responsibility. And it's in that moment that you as a man, you either act or you delay. And that decision right there is what defines you. So why does Josiah matter in all of this? Okay, because he matters because he didn't just recognize truth. Okay, he moved on it fully. He didn't wait for any kind of form of approval. He didn't just ease into it. And he didn't negotiate with what was wrong. And honestly, the fact that he did those things, that's super rare. It was rare then, and it's rare now. And that's the standard that I'm trying to share with you here today, because the Bible, it doesn't celebrate Josiah because he was some perfect king. In fact, he wasn't. The way that he wound up dying was because he literally went and fought a war that God told him not to fight, or I think through a prophet maybe that told God to tell him not to fight. Basically, he went against God's will, and he wound up dying because of it. So he was far from perfect, okay? But what it does do, what the Bible does say about Josiah, it celebrates him because he aligned. He aligned decisively, and that's what the standard is, guys. It's not how much do you know, but what do you do when you know? So let's go ahead and talk about the danger for a moment of partial alignment. Some men, they think that small adjustments in and of themselves are enough. Oh, I'll fix this one area, I'll clean up this part, I'll ease into it. And I want to say for a second, that's not to say that you can't, you know, it's not about like quitting things cold turkey or immediately making these aggressive changes, because that's tough. It's about radically changing your life, and sometimes that is in the small decisions. So I want to make that differentiation there. Um, Now here's the thing though. Partial obedience is still disobedience, okay? Josiah, he didn't remove some idols. He removed all of them because he understood you cannot build alignment on top of compromise. So look, most men, they're stuck waiting for the right time, the right feeling, the right conditions. But truth, it doesn't wait, and neither should you. When you see clearly, move on it. Tear down what doesn't belong. Rebuild what does. Because the man who delays alignment will eventually justify misalignment. But the man who acts immediately becomes someone that God can trust with real weight. So I urge you, walk in the way of the Lord, or don't. But understand everything flows from that decision.